Welcome back to another episode of Filthy Hope. If it's your first time here, we're so glad you could join us. Welcome. On this podcast, we spend time in the grey spaces where Jesus, life, and culture intersect. I'm your host, Pastor Jonty, and today we have a very exciting conversation that I am thrilled to share with you. Earlier today, I recorded an interview with author, missiologist, and theologian Mike Frost. You may be familiar with some of his books that have been quite popular in Christian circles over the years. So we'll jump over to that interview very shortly. Before we do, I do need to tell you all about our live show that is coming up on the 30th of June at Turramurra Uniting Church. Rev Ness and I are going to be talking about this idea of future-proof faith. How can we build a faith and a faith community around it that is fit for the future and everything that might be coming our way as the years roll on into the rest of this century. We've got a bunch of special guests lined up. I can announce now 3 of those guests who are Somerset Drayton, who we've had on the podcast before, Reverend Phil Swain, who has also been on the podcast before, and Joyce Tungy from the Pulse team in the Uniting Church New South Wales ACT. Those are 3 of the guests that are going to be joining us on the couch. We would love for you to join us. Down below in the video description or in the podcast show notes, there is a link that you can follow to register. We'll be feeding you. It is free, but we do need you to register so that we know how many people we're going to be feeding. So once again, that is Sunday, June the 30th at 6 p.m. at Turramurra Uniting Church. We would love to see you there. If you can't make it in person, there is also an option, if you follow the link down below, to get the live stream so you can watch it from the comfort of your own home. But we do encourage you, if you can make it in person, do come and hang out with us in person. There'll be, like always with these live shows that we do, there'll be an audience Q&A that is... it won't be recorded, so you do need to, if you want to come and take part, share some food with us and just be in community with us, then we would love to see you there in person. For those of you that can't make it, there will be some content being shared from that event here on the podcast feed, but it'll just be a snippet of the experience that you'll get if you come and hang out with us. We hope to see you there. All the details, like I said, all down below. But for now, let's jump straight over to our interview with special guest Mike Frost. I'll see you on the other side. Well, my guest on the podcast today is a minister, a missiologist, a theologian, and is the founding director of the Tinsley Institute, located in Morling College here in Sydney. But a lot of our listeners will quite possibly be familiar with him as an author of such books as Keep Christianity Weird, Surprise the World, The Road to Missional, and most recently, Mission is the Shape of Water. Michael Frost, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Johnny. Great to be here.
We're thrilled to have you. I guess that's a bit of a log line for who Michael Frost is. Maybe for our listeners to get to know you a little bit better, what does a day in the life of Michael Frost look like at a more down to earth ground level? What's a day in the life of Michael Frost at the moment?
Yeah, well, they're not all the same. That's the problem. So I've been teaching full time at Morling College, as you mentioned, for 25 years or something. So I guess that's a day in the life. I'm a full-time lecturer in a theological school over kind of connected with Macquarie University in the north of Sydney. So I teach, I write, I supervise students, but then over and above that, some of those books that you mentioned have been kind of fairly popular in certain circles, and so I do a lot of consulting and traveling and speaking at conferences and what have you. So it's kind of a combo of travel and speaking, kind of anchored in a team, like a faculty team with students, held accountable, and then also kind of free to float around and, cause trouble. So, and sometimes those things clash. Occasionally the principal has to call me into his office, but on the whole, it's kind of a good combination. I think, I don't think I'd be great if just left to my own devices, just to be kind of, sort of speaker guy. But I also think I might be a bit bored if I was just, stuck in the academy. So I've managed somehow, I don't think there was a lot of planning involved, but somehow I've managed to find a nice combo of kind of that kind of freedom and responsibility.
Mm, yeah. And we mentioned that books, as a bit of a geek here myself and a budding writer, I'm always curious to talk to writers about what was the impetus to first start writing. And you've written, I can't remember how many books now, some co-authored as well. Take me all the way back to before a Mike Frost book has been released. Where did that urge to start writing begin?
Yeah, that is a good question because I do meet a lot of ministers who have a real drive to get published, but it just feels like they think that's the thing to do. And I hope that wasn't me back then. It might have been part of that, might have been the motivation, but I think writing is one of the primary ways that I kind of process ideas. And I mean, I would journal or blog or whatever, even if I didn't get published. You know what I mean? I feel like it's an urge. The urge is to write more than it is to be read, although obviously you'd like to be read, but it's not so much to kind of, get best-selling books or anything. It's more, this is just part of who I am. And as you say, I've written a bunch of them now, so it's really become a pretty core part of my identity and practice. So from the very beginning, my very first book was one called Jesus the Fool, and I had preached a series on Jesus' parables and the way he behaves kind of like a jester, like the way parables kind of turn on their audiences and not trick them, but kind of sneak up behind them, that kind of jester fool type kind of way of kind of slipping under people's defenses. And someone was in the congregation who worked at a publishing house and said, if you wrote those up, as chapters and added a few more, like that's a book. And so I did that and I submitted it to him. And then he said, oh yeah, no, we would never publish a book called Jesus the Fool. Um, and but he said it's a pretty good book, but yeah, we're a pretty conservative publishing. So why don't you try Albatross Books? Now, Jonty, you probably never heard of Albatross Books because you look too young to me to have ever heard of them. But there was a radical discipleship type guy called John Waterhouse back in the day, very influenced by people like John Smith and John Hurt and people like that. And he started his own publishing house called Albatross Books. And, if you went to him with a title saying Jesus the Fool and the conservative publishers don't want to touch this, he like wrote out a contract straight away. It's like, that's exactly the kind of thing I want. I want to go broke publishing books that everyone's going to be offended by. I mean, I don't think the book is very offensive at all, but the title's a little bit, well, maybe not so much these days, but back then it was considered a little bit kind of too much. So that's how I got started. Like that publisher who wouldn't publish it, kind of suggesting I write it, and then John Waterhouse saying, we love it, we'll take it. And it was kind of a minor hit. It was more, there was a bit of controversy around it. And in fact, I teach at Morling College, but years ago, I remember looking in the library at Morling College and seeing Jesus the Fool on the shelves, and I pulled it out to see if it got borrowed very often. And someone had with a texter had crossed out fool on the front cover. So even Morling students didn't particularly like it. But once that book came out, caused a bit of a stir, and then John Waterhouse said, what else you got? Like, let's nurture you, let's get you writing. So I did 3 books with that guy, and that kind of set me off pretty much. I mean, that's not a very helpful story for emerging writers to just suddenly find, this fairy godfather who just appeared in my life and published me. It's not something that I say go do that. Like it's not like someone can necessarily find people like that. I think publishing in conventional publishing these days is like super hard. The bottom's kind of falling out of it. But so yeah, what am I saying? I don't know if I got a whole lot of advice for anybody, but I kind of fell into it and it was perfect for me, and I'm really thankful for it.
Mm. And with Mission of the Shape of Water being your most recent book, I'd be curious to know, like, Jesus the Fool compared all the way last year to Mission is the Shape of Water. is there, I imagine there are things that have changed a lot in terms of your approach to writing in that time, but I imagine there's also probably some things that, the principles of writing have stayed pretty similar for you along the way. Are there things either side of that that kind of resonate with you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. But interestingly, both now that you mention it, I hadn't thought of this before, but both of them were written in similar ways. So I said that Jesus the Fool was a series of sermons and then got kind of worked up into chapters, and then I added some other stuff. And Mission is the Shape of Water basically came from my teaching material from a subject I teach. I teach a unit called The History of Christian Mission. So I pretty much worked up that book from the material from my classes. So that they're quite similar when I think about it now. But that hasn't always been the case. Say back with John Waterhouse, it's like, what do you want to write about? And then it was like, whoa, what do I want to write about? It was like open slather. And then there are other times when, probably my most successful book has been called The Shaping of Things to Come, which I co-authored with Alan Hirsch. And Alan and I were teaching, or we'd started a kind of anti-theological college as kind of a missional training course, I suppose. And so we wrote that as the textbook for the program was called Forge. So we wrote that as a textbook pretty much. Here are the notes for Forge. And we would have been okay if it never got published. We just would have like printed it on a photocopier or something, I suppose. But a publisher did show some interest in it, and blow me down, mate. I'm the most surprised person that became the most successful book that I've ever written. And I mean, still, like that was 20 years ago that came out. And I still encounter people who say, oh, that book, opened my eyes, or I read that book and things were different. I read that book, I quit my job and went and did something or other. I mean, sometimes I feel like, God, I hope it worked, because I feel like terribly responsible for a book like landing like that in people's lives. But so they've all kind of been different in different ways, I suppose. So that's similar. There's a similarity that what I write comes out of what I teach or do. So that's similar and has been all the way through from Jesus the Fool through to The Shape of Water. But what's different? I'm better now at writing, I think. I'm more measured. That might sound not a good thing, but I am more conscious of being responsible as a writer. I think when you first start, you just kind of you blurt, you just got a million things to say. And my sort of personality as a contrarian and a troublemaker was, back in the day, I liked saying stuff that kind of pissed people off. Whereas, I'm an old guy now, Jonty. I don't need to do that kind of stuff.
Well, that probably is a really nice segue into this idea of mission, and I think I'm probably an example of this, where my idea of what mission is, what like growing up, I had relatives who were missionaries
Right.
who were around, and then all of a sudden they weren't. They were overseas, living in a different country for a number of years, and that's what my idea of mission was like. At some point, God might tap you on the shoulder, and you're like, all right, pack the bags. We're off to a country to share the gospel with people that haven't heard the gospel potentially. And it's been a process of, a number of years kind of reimagining for me, just through life, being a part of a church and being part of communities, but then also as an adult, kind of stepping into some roles of leadership in the church, and understanding what mission is for me. So I guess question for you to kind of set some ground rules maybe for some of our listeners that may not even understand this word mission. At its core, what is mission?
Yeah. Well, it's a bit on the nose as a word, and certainly the word missionary is, as you just mentioned before. Like, I think people who now do the kind of thing you talked about your relatives doing, today they don't call themselves missionaries, they call themselves cross-cultural workers or something like that. Mainly because, I guess, of its connection to kind of the colonial era, the 19th century, early 20th century, which got a worse rap than probably it deserves, but it still did deserve a bad rap of kind of, Westerners going to India or Africa or other parts of the world and kind of imposing a kind of a Western construct on faith and church. And the classic example would be David Livingstone's line that we have to take the 3 C's to Africa, which is we have to civilize them, we have to commercialize them, and we have to Christianize them. So, and it was all in the best interest. It's like these poor people are living in uncivilized, I'm doing air quotes even though people can't see me, uncivilized kind of lives, which means that they don't live lives like we do in Britain. And so we have to kind of bring to them kind of the kind of modern Western ways of being and doing. We need to commercialize their living hand to mouth, or they're hunter gatherers, or in some cases they're selling members of their own community into slavery in order to kind of fund the nation. And so, like, let's introduce kind of farming or fishing or something like that, and then we have to Christianize them. And that link, obviously, between kind of Western culture and materialism and commercialism and Christianity, so interwoven, definitely gets a bad rap. And so, yeah, by the end of the 20th century, no one wanted to call themselves a missionary anymore. And there's nothing magical about the word. I'm happy that no one uses it anymore. That's fine. The word mission, I do still use that because I teach a lot of units in mission, and I write about mission. It's not a Bible word, which is the problem people have, Christians have, trying to define it, because you kind of can't just go to the Bible and say, what are all the references to mission in here, and how does the Bible define it? So it's a Latin word. It comes from a Latin word, not from a Greek word. It just means sent, to be pushed out. We get the word emit or emission or those sorts of words from it. And I just take it to be the kind of coverall term that describes the outward-facing orientation of the faith community of Jesus and their relationship to the world and the culture around them. Like, there are all sorts of ways the Bible talks about the internal life of the church, about what worship or community or discipleship or formation or all those sorts of things might look like. But then it also talks about the church's engagement in the life and culture of the world around them. And that word we often refer to as mission. So my shorthand definition of mission is not one I made up. I got it from a guy called David Bosch. He's a South African missiologist, and he said that the mission of God's people is to alert everyone everywhere to the universal reign of God through Christ. And so for him, and indeed for me, mission is rooted or anchored in this idea that God reigns, and that his reign is peaceable and good, and it's a place of healing and joy and justice and an experience of his benevolent presence and a new way of being human and a new kind of society, and that is unfurling throughout the world. And our task, our mission, if you like, is to let people know, to alert them to the fact that God reigns and that his spirit is slowly but surely, inexorably, throughout history and around the world, unfolding this idea of his reign or his rule or his kingdom. And there are a variety of ways we can do that. Like, we can do that by talking about it, explaining it, telling people about it, but all words and no action is pretty abusive. And so we also need to show people. Sometimes we just need to show people and don't need to talk. Sometimes we just get to talk and don't get to show people. But overall, I think our mission are all the ways that we both show and tell people what that reign of God looks like. It's beauty and it's joy and it's freedom and all the kind of best and most beautiful stuff. And it can look African, and it can look Indian, and it can look Australian, and it can look American, and it takes different forms and is expressed in different ways in different cultures. That's the really remarkable thing about it.
Mm. Something that you just said has really clicked for me. It was this idea that sometimes if we and I'd written that quote down, actually, the alerting everyone to God's universal reign through Christ, which I love. But when that is done entirely through words with no action, did you use the word abusive? That becomes abuse?
Well, yeah, I'd say, I've often said this, like, if you were in a marriage where your partner never showed you any love at all, but kept telling you that they loved you. Of course I love you. You know, I married you, didn't I? I go to work and provide for you, or whatever. Like, yeah, all words.
Mm.
Then we would consider that to be something really unhealthy,
Yeah.
if not abusive in that. And yeah, I do fear that there are a lot of churches that just, well, whether they want to do this or not, find themselves thinking about mission being like that. Mission is just evangelism or personal witness or getting people to come to church. And it's a lot of words. And I think that unless it's also demonstrated by acts of justice, by a community of joyful, peaceable people who love Jesus, by reconciliation and freedom. And unless we show people what this looks like, unless we feed the hungry, we serve the poor, how can we talk about the fact that Jesus came to bring a new way of being human that included people being fed and the poor being lifted up and so on and so forth? So there has to be both action and words. But I'd say the same thing on the opposite end of the spectrum. You know, some people say, "Oh, preach the gospel always, and if necessary, use words." Like, it's, you know, people will look at my actions and they will know that I believe in the reign of God through Christ. It's like, yeah, I'm not sure they could quite decipher that just from our commitment to serving the poor or advocating for justice or whatever the case may be. There's got to be some words involved in helping people to make sense of why we're doing what we're doing. So it's both. It's announcement and it's demonstration in equal parts, if you can ever kind of measure them in parts.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think I've it's so interesting kind of being able to identify that kind of balance across just when you encounter different church communities and different groups and different cultures, because you can so clearly, like, I mean, coming from the United Church, for as an example, the stereotype is that we're all social justice.
Yeah.
And the to the extreme of that is exactly like you say, the I feel like that's been misquoted. Like, does anyone know who said
No,
let's preach the
no one knows
gospel?
who said it.
Yeah, that's
They
that
say St.
stereotype.
Francis said it, but I've never found out any reference to him actually saying it.
Yeah, and that's that stereotype of, always doing acts of justice and helping other people sans actually preaching the gospel, versus if you look all the way to the other end of the scale, and, like, the evangelical church as an example. um but the thing that I notice is that it's so easy then to just start throwing stones from where you are on that spectrum, as opposed to actually, coming at it with grace and engaging with people in those cultures and different denominations and different faith practices, um, yeah, in a more productive way, rather than going, "Oh, you guys don't preach the gospel," or "You guys don't do any social justice," or whatever it is.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I feel like that this idea of mission taking on the shape of whatever container it's poured into, which is kind of the central metaphor of the book. Mission is the shape of water. Just as soon as I started reading, I was like, "Oh, that's exactly what it is. That makes total sense to me." I guess follow-up question then is can you talk a little bit more about this idea that mission does take on whatever shape of the container it is that you pour, whatever the context it is that you're doing mission into, it
yeah.
fills that shape.
Yeah, well, like I said before, there's all sorts of internal lives of a church, worship or discipleship or formation or all those sorts of things, and our theology and our belief system and our practices and liturgy and blah, 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 that you might be able to say, well, the world, the culture around me has no business having a say in that. Like, we determine our own internal life ourselves. I still think culture should have some impact on that, but you could say, sorry, but this is internal church business. We're on our own managing this. But if you believe that the mission of the church is a gift to the community around it, to the neighborhood, to the culture, then it has to be done. All that kind of stuff we talked about before, preaching or witness or act of kindness or social justice, that is done in partnership with people in the world around you. And so in that respect, it's kind of like the church's gift to the world. And the world, therefore, has to then have a say in what shape it takes. What does it look like? Like, if it's for us, then it ought to fit with us in some particular way. This isn't to say we get to kind of compromise our essential beliefs or anything, but in some contexts, mission will very routinely take on the shape of serving the poor, or advocating for justice, or assisting refugees, and in other cases, you might be in a context where there's not such a need for that. You might be advocating for that, but you may actually be kind of really engaging with kind of more sort of financially comfortable people. And in that case, there may be more words about helping people to shake off the kind of restrictions and limitations of consumerism or materialism and the like. So the context is necessarily going to kind of shape what we do. And then as soon as you start talking about that in all sorts of different settings, people, like you just said, think, yeah, of course it would look different when it's done in this context or in that context. And if we're smart about it, rather than saying, I'm going to package up the mission of the church into some kind of prefabbed box and just kind of plant that all around the world and watch, it doesn't work. I talked before about David Livingstone and the 3 Cs. It's like, just take that from Scotland, where he was from, and plonk that right into Southern Africa. And it's like, of course it didn't work. He hardly led anybody to Jesus. He was a bit of a failed missionary, to be quite honest. But there was just a sort of a solid, impervious notion of what we've come here to bring to you, as distinct from other missionaries who often went into places like Africa or India and were actually much more oriented toward what would the gospel actually look like if it took root in this place and the reign of God burst forth among these people, affirming those things that can be affirmed, being kind of neutral on those things that are neither here nor there, and then resisting those things which are contrary to the gospel. What would that look like? And I mean, there are a bunch of stories in the book about people who went with a particular preconceived notion, and the context, mainly because the context was pretty dramatic, demanded that they actually reshape what they had in mind. And in some cases, and often they're women, were willing to kind of abandon the original plan and simply respond to the needs or the challenges of the time. So I tell the story about Mary Slessor, who went as a kind of preaching evangelist, and she would travel in boats up the river systems of Nigeria to sort of tribes that claimed they would kill anyone who came from the outside world. And this actually helped her, I think, very pale-skinned and had flaming red hair. So when she got out of a boat in this village in the middle of the Nigerian jungle somewhere, they were like, what is this? And that allowed her some connection to people. But what she discovered was that there was a policy, what's this, a superstition, that any twins that had been born were cursed of the devil, and therefore they were left out in the jungle to die. They were bringing a curse on the village. So she would collect them. I mean, she would see them and collect them. And so she would turn up in a boat with 4, 6 kids, like one on a hip and 2 walking behind. I mean, it was unheard of. And in the end, she collects so many of these abandoned children, she ends up starting effectively what we would call an orphanage, but she considers it to be her own home, and she adopts all of these children. Now, my point in raising her is she didn't go there to start orphanages. She didn't. I mean, we shouldn't start orphanages. She doesn't go there because it's some policy from head office. She goes there because she goes there and then she responds to a particular and unusual or unlikely need in a particular context. The other great story, one of my favorite stories in the book, is about Alice Seeley Harris, who went to the Congo, and again, as a classic evangelical Baptist missionary, she went. If you see photos of her, she looks like Catherine Hepburn from the African Queen. She's got a white linen dress and a big white hat. I mean, she's a classic. This was the early 20th century, but she's a classic kind of 19th century missionary looking woman. She took a camera with her, which was really early in the piece for missionaries to carry cameras. And when she got there, she started to hear evidence of what was effectively a genocide, just the most atrocious human rights violation of the 20th century by King Leopold in the so-called Belgian Congo, or the Congo Free State. It wasn't free and it wasn't a state. And so she abandoned her original plan as a preaching missionary and ended up sneaking in through the jungle into the Congo, where she would photograph people who'd been mutilated and would take down their testimonies. And she gathers this dossier of photographs and of testimonies, takes them back to Britain, does a preaching tour around Britain, showing the photos in a magic lantern display, which is a bit like a slideshow, and then reading or retelling the stories of the victims of the Belgian king, the Belgian Congo. And then does the same thing in America and puts so much pressure on both Britain and America to act on this that then it's brought to, there was no European Union then, but to a court where King Leopold was so shamed by it, he withdraws from the Congo altogether and closes down the so-called Congo Free State. And she took just 5 years to do that. Now, anyone who's done any advocacy work or tried to kind of work any kind of shift in people's perceptions on things will know that was super, super quick. She's an absolute legend, and she's passed away now, but she was regarded as one of the kind of first ever of those kind of human rights advocates that now we think of as being much more common. Now, again, she didn't go to Africa to go and kind of completely free the Congolese from Belgian control. But when she got there, she found herself in the context of a really dramatic and violent, evil situation. Now, she could have turned her back and said, well, actually, I'm called to the Bololo people, which is where she'd gone. And what's happening just across the river in the Congo, that's not really my thing. I'm called to this. But the context shaped her perspective. She could not engage this, and she could not be silent about this. And so advocacy became the shape of mission for her when she hadn't planned to do that in the first place.
My next question, my follow-up, I feel like you've just answered, but it was going to be, I have conversations with close friends in my communities around what it is to understand what God might be calling you to in terms of mission, like what our outward-facing goals are, and how to understand like where to take the first step, where to try. And I think something you said earlier was, and in that example, she had no option. It presented itself to her, and she had to act. And I wonder, for some of us may not have. It's not a luxury. It's a maybe a gift to be given such clear of an idea. I have to act on this. Maybe for some of us who haven't encountered that yet, how do we know where to start? Is there, is it through discernment? Is it through prayer? I mean, it's probably a combination of all of these things, but from your perspective, is there a particular way that you understand that first process of, okay, so what do I do? Where do I act? Where do I go?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to disagree with you a bit. She could have not acted. I mean, she could have resisted that because she wasn't in the Congo. The Congo was closed from outsiders. She had to sneak through the jungles into the Congo to get all those testimonies. So she could have easily have said, look, that's not my calling. I'm called to the Bololo people on the Bololo River, not the Congo River. And the presence of the camera was really important. Like nobody had cameras back in the day. Like this was a really expensive gift that someone gave her and said, why don't you take photos of missionary life and send them back so we know what you're doing. Now, every cross-cultural worker in the world does that all the time now. But this was like a really crazy idea. Why don't you take some photos? So the presence of this particular technology meant that she thought, well, here's a way to actually record all of this. So it was an interesting combination of the challenge, the particular technology in her case, or hardware that she had at her disposal. And there was something obviously about her personality. I mean, she was kind of fearless in lots of respects. And you can even see that in the kind of the preaching tour that she organizes. So she could have resisted all of that, but there are a number of things that conspired, not just the challenge of the context. And so with respect to your question, I guess we do need to ask ourselves, what do we have at our disposal? That may be technology, or that may be certain resources that we have available to us. I don't know. but also it requires us actually being curious about the context that we find ourselves in. So, I mean, Alice Harris first encountered what was going on in the Congo because a Congolese man stumbled into the Bololo mission carrying the remnants of his wife and daughter that had been chopped up and slaughtered right before his eyes. And so she then started to follow him in through the jungles and start to meet other people. So part of it is actually kind of stepping into the jungle, I guess. It's start kind of talking to the people in your community. Go meet the mayor, go meet the school principals. I'll tell you who knows what the shape of mission should be in your neighborhood. It's school principals. Like if you've ever been to a kind of a high school sort of come to my high school kind of talk by a principal, they can always tell you, what the level of instances of domestic violence or divorce or crime, or they know exactly what they're up against, and they'll always say, and we're fighting that, we're writing a different future for our kids, and God love them. I mean, I think that's great. You want a principal like that, so go talk to them, because they'll tell you what's going on in the jungle. They'll tell you what's happening, where the shape of mission might be, or where mission might be shaped in this particular context. I preached at a church. It was a Pentecostal church actually in Melbourne a couple of years ago, and they had the school principal show up to thank the church for the gift the church had paid for them to renovate their wellness centre in the school, and new couches and blinds and carpets and painted the walls and all that sort of stuff. It was really generous of the church, and so the principal showed up, showed us some photos and thanked us all. And she was talking about, we all know our neighborhood, there's this instance of domestic violence and this level of unemployment and blah, blah. She's going through all the stats. And she said, and you and we are writing a different future for our neighborhood. And I talked to her afterwards. I preached, and then she came to me afterwards and was, thanks for your sermon. That was good. I said, oh, you don't go to this church? No. Do you go to another church? No, she said, no, I don't go to church. Oh, I grew up Catholic or something like that. But, not the least bit Christian or anything like that, but totally on board with all these aspects of the reign of God. Like, we want to eliminate violence. We want to eliminate poverty. We want to, eliminate hopelessness. Like, we want to kind of bring something to our neighborhood which actually writes a better future for the children in our care. And you think, like, there's such obvious sympathies there between kind of those of us who believe that this is what God wants us to do, and people who've just intuited that as kind of a humanistic response to the needs around them. Well, I go talk to those people. They'll tell you kind of where the needs are or what it is that we might need to photograph or get witness to or respond to in some particular way.
Yeah, I resonate with that so deeply. I took I part of what I do at my church community is I'm volunteering, just leading the youth group on a Friday night, and we took them on a trip last year to see the people out at the people running the Exodus Foundation and the people at Wayside, and for them it was this experience, like debriefing it with them afterwards. I had no idea that this frontier was here on our doorstep, and it was just this process of talking to the people living in the same city as them and kind of being having their eyes open to the reality of what life is like for people. And it was just as simple as introducing them to someone and then them introducing them to someone else, and all of a sudden the conversations linked up, and they had an entirely new perspective on what it means to live in Sydney, but what it means to be a person that follows Jesus as a response to that. When you're confronted with whether it's homelessness or domestic violence or whatever it is, then being compelled by the gospel, I feel like I have to do something. And then it's the challenge of, what is it? What are you?
And that might be, I need to go volunteer in a thing that's already happening. I need to kind of help fund a thing that's already happening, or whatever the case. Or it might be, oh, no one's doing anything about this. I need to maybe consider launching something into this space. So don't always assume that that we have to launch something or start something. If someone else is doing it, then get behind it.
Yeah. I guess I'd be interested to know. Shape of Water, Mission as a Shape of Water came out last year. I can't remember exactly
Yeah,
when.
yeah. Yep.
So has it been out a year yet? Not quite.
No, it came out September last year.
September. Yeah. So I imagine you've had just countless conversations with people about the book. Now, looking back on the process of, and you said it came from some material beforehand, is there anything now looking back on it that you wish you had talked about more in the book, or is there something that, in retrospect, in the handful of months since, you would go back and add as another chapter?
Oh, Jonty, God. I mean, it's 2,000 years of Christian history. It's like, I mean, I had to leave stacks out,
Okay,
So
yeah, cool.
yeah. No, there's plenty that I could have put in there. It's really like a skim across the surface of kind of, yeah, as I said, 2,000 years of Christian history. It starts, way back with the early church, and then it looks at the Celtic mission movement, and then into the kind of the Roman Catholic missionary orders, and it keeps on going all the way through into the kind of Pietist movement, and then the Great Awakenings in America, and then the so-called Great Century, the 19th century right up until the 20th century. But yeah, look, there's stacks I put in there. I did hardly anything on Catholic mission. I don't think I did anything on Catholic mission in South America, which is another really interesting and checkered kind of story. But like that whole continent, kind of left out, to be honest. And somebody kind of got a bit peeved at me in a conversation about the fact there's so little in it about Australia. I mean, there's a story about the Mennonite missions in Victoria, but people are like, well, why did you leave Australia out of them? You're an Australian. I mean, you should have a whole section on Australia. I mean, the book is published internationally, and not that many people are interested in the history of mission in Australia, let alone in the rest of the world. But yeah, no, there was plenty that I could have addressed. Plenty I could have included. So I don't think I'm planning to write a sequel or anything like that. But yeah, there's lots that I think. Or I was a bit chastened by the Australian comment. I thought maybe I ought to have addressed that a bit more. The Australian mission history story is pretty piecemeal. So there's some kind of quite good stories you can tell, like the Mennonites or Lancelot Threlkeld. How's this for a name? Lancelot Threlkeld, who was he was a Presbyterian missionary in New South Wales who translated huge sections of the Bible into local dialects, and was a great champion of Indigenous peoples. But yeah, there's some good stories like that, but then there's the whole mission station stories, and of course you can't avoid the stolen generations and all sorts of ways in which the church became co-opted into practices that were, really contrary to the gospel. So, and anyway, there's already been a couple of books written about the history of mission in Australia. So, but maybe I could have touched a bit more on my own country. So yeah, maybe I regret that a bit.
You mentioned the like the early church as well, and it's something that certainly in my faith communities we often bring up, this idea of like, oh well, how can we be more like early church Christians? And I guess my my feeling is that question is usually asked by people who don't have a great understanding of the early church, and like it as an idea. I guess, what are there any things that you like, practices or missional stances, or I guess just practices that we see in the early church that you think could be adopted better or to our benefit today in the 21st century Western kind of Christian culture?
Well, I mean, the early church is pretty kind of raw and uncluttered, and for that reason, it's kind of like, oh, you kind of can look right into it and distill some of the kind of really important stuff about being church in a way that it becomes much more murky and cluttered as time goes on. I often hear people say, oh, if we only get back to the Jerusalem church, and you're like, excuse me, the Jerusalem church made quite a few mistakes, you might recall. So yeah, we shouldn't romanticize some of these things as though they're all completely perfect. And Jerusalem certainly wasn't. I mean, Antioch looks like it was pretty good, although we got limited kind of knowledge about what was going on in Antioch, other than that it was a really multicultural, multi-ethnic kind of church that kind of really forged what we might understand to be the kind of the early church's work into Asia Minor and then into Africa and Europe. But for them, they had no buildings, and they had no money. In certain parts of, I mean, we always have this impression the early church was all being persecuted and hunted down, and it was terrible. But there was that did happen in some parts of the Roman Empire, but in lots of backwater or smaller towns or places like that, most Christians continued kind of in a pretty unmolested kind of way. And I think what you can reconstruct was happening was kind of really beautiful experience of church around the table and of Jews and Gentiles, men and women, the rich, the poor, slaves and free people coming together, and not just sitting together, and listening to someone pontificate, but actually prophesying or leading or interpreting or teaching, bursting forth in song. There's this beautiful sense which the Holy Spirit was kind of moving among ordinary, untrained, unqualified peoples, and in some cases peoples who were considered to be less than, were validated and affirmed and were present around the table. And this was not an uncommon experience in the ancient world. There were a lot of guild meetings and other such meetings that happened kind of outdoors in courtyards or market squares or back alleys. Big tables would be kind of put out and meals would happen, but they were always just men, and they were usually men of a similar or the same socioeconomic level. And they included a ritual and then lots of kind of business interactions and the like. So if you were walking home one day and you took a shortcut down a back alley and you saw a big long table and all these people sitting around it, you immediately would think it was a guild meeting. That's none of your business. You're not in that world. You might not be a man. You may not be a free man. So all you do is walk by and ignore them, and they ignore you. But when the Christians got meeting, they did the same thing around tables, in back alleys or courtyards. Food was involved. They too had rituals. I mean, the guilds would slaughter birds or small animals and have little smoke offerings where they would burn these offerings, and the smoke would go up apparently to the nostrils of their patron gods. And so you'd think, I don't get what that ritual is or what they're doing, but it's none of my business. You just walk right past it. But when you walk past the Christian one, they did a ritual too, and there was bread and wine involved. But the remarkable thing about it was men, women, the young, the poor, the rich, they're all sitting together around a table. I can't tell you how viscerally stunning that must have been, because nobody ever saw anything like that. And then as you walk by, they were doing something with this wine and you weren't sure what that meant, but it's none of your business. But they would say to you, friend, don't walk by. Like, have you prepared your evening meal tonight? Like, come, join us, eat our meat, drink our wine. There's more than enough for everyone. And you're invited into this gathering. And I mean, I'm not kidding. It was just gobsmacking that you should be at a table with a collection of people like this. And that slave across the table then suddenly starts teaching, or that woman over there suddenly starts prophesying, or it would be just like, what is happening here? And then they would say to you, and you would say, where is your God? Which God up there are you praying to? And they're like, no, the God is not up there. Like, wherever two or three of us gather, he is here at this table. Like, it was just bizarre. And there was something so, I might say, kind of naive and uncluttered about this. I think Stanley Hauerwas is the guy who said that the early church conquered the Roman Empire not with swords and spears, but with tables. These tables just proliferated around the world as it was known at the time. and transformed people into a new kind of person. And then that ultimately then would spread from one village or town to another. So there is something pretty cool about the early church that's definitely worth learning. It was localized, it was inclusive, it was spirit-led, it was really committed to the poor. Like, it was said that if Christians in one village heard that the nearby village had contracted plague and people were dying, 2 or 3 or 4 of them would go to move to that village to live there in order to launch a church there and then die with those people there. Like, things like that were just like breathtaking in their sort of sense of courage and foolhardiness. So there is lots we can learn from that. But, like, as I said, I look at all these stages in history in that book, and then you think about like the Jesuits and the stuff that they did in the 1500s. And I told the story about Alice Seeley Harris in the Congo jungles. I mean, I think courage and daring and innovation, these are all elements of Christian mission, it seems, or at least they have been throughout history.
Mm. Yeah, and the thing that sticks out to me a lot is this like radical inclusivity. This idea, like you were saying, no, come in, uh, come and share this with us.
Yeah.
Which yeah, it's my kind of observation that we love to talk about inclusivity. It's another thing entirely to actually practice radical inclusivity that turns heads and actually gives off when people walk past, I'm welcome here, and that's weird.
Yeah.
And like that drawing in of everybody. Yeah, it's something that I think about a lot in terms of how we achieve that more.
Yeah. Well, I feel like also the church has become enamored of excellence. And so we've got to run our meetings, and the music has to be excellent, and the preacher has to be excellent, and the seating and the air conditioning and the coffee and blah, 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 all has to be excellent. People are attracted to excellence. And I'm not opposed to excellence in terms of kind of the offering of one's very best to the stuff that's important to you. But it can be very exclusive. I mean, it just pushes people away. All you can then become is an observer or a taster of that experience. You don't participate in it or contribute to it. And I feel that, we in our quest for excellence, we have compromised our commitment to, as you say, inclusivity and hospitality.
Mm.
So sometimes it's like when just anyone gets a say and people can be led by the Spirit, sometimes it can be a bit shit.
Mm. Yeah. I'd love to continue this conversation. I'm just wary of the time as well. So I guess if people want to continue this conversation, Michael's very active on Facebook. Is that a good place for people to reach out if they want to follow up with anything? Or if...
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm on Facebook and Insta, and I've got a website, mikefrost.net.
Awesome. Yeah. And just finally, I do want to ask you about people that have seen any video of this will have noticed quite a nice record collection sitting behind you.
Yeah.
I'm regularly mocked by some of my friends for collecting what's sometimes called big CDs. I guess for you, how long has music been a part of your life, and when did physical records kind of start to become a part of your life?
Okay, so if anyone is watching this, they'll see this big white beard of mine, and they'll know that obviously I'm an old guy. So yeah, the first music I bought was on vinyl, like, because I was a teenager in the 70s. So in this record collection, there are some records I've had for like 50 years. Yeah, it was my first kind of medium, I suppose. So there is a nostalgia. Someone asked me recently, do you like vinyl because of the rich depth of tonal quality, or because you're an old guy? And I said, it could be both, like, I mean, I think the discussion about, vinyl being a richer sound was probably more a 90s conversation when we were comparing it with CDs where the sound files were compressed. So streamed or digital music is pretty good quality. So I wouldn't say, oh yeah, vinyl's the only way to listen to music beautifully. But there is something, I guess, nostalgic for me. I've been collecting them for a long time. It was my first medium. But I always say the reason I love them most is because listening to records is an activity. It's for a lot of people, music is something that you stream to create ambient sound while you're doing something else. I'm reading a book, I'm working in my office, I've got friends over, I put some music on, and that's fine. I use music that way too. It's digital music. But when I say to my wife, oh, I think I might go and play some records, she knows that that is a thing I'm doing. I'm not sitting there twiddling my thumbs. Like, I'm going through my collection. I pull out 6 or 8 records. I start to play one. I read the liner notes. I then think, oh, wow, James Taylor played guitar on Joni Mitchell's Blue album. Like, who else was on that album? And then, I start Googling. I go pull that record out. I mean, it's a very tactile and kind of demanding medium. So my daughters always are like, oh, Dad, you got to turn the record over every 5 songs. And it's like, that's the point. It demands that you stay attentive to it. It's like you can't walk away or do something else. You have to actually attend to this. So I love it because it's an activity in and of itself, but also probably because I'm old. I don't know why you like it, Jonty, but I like it because it's old. I'm old.
It's a similar, like the activity of listening to music as opposed to having it on in the background. That's a big thing for
Yeah.
me. Well, is there a process for deciding what enters the collection? Are you fairly like specific and is there a tight funnel, or is it more kind of, do you not think about it that much when you're buying records?
Oh, there's a bunch of them in my collection I've had for forever. There was a period when vinyl was so out of vogue, you could walk into a charity shop or an op shop and you could find really, really good albums for $2. So I picked up a bunch, back 20 years ago when people were throwing out their record collections. Stupid people. Um, uh, these days, you won't find any good vinyl, I don't think, in an op shop or anything like that. So you've got to go to a market or a record store. So is there a criterion? I guess, I like kind of soul, blues, folk kind of music. So there's a certain genre that I like. Sometimes I buy them because they're nostalgic. It's like, oh, I had this album back in the day. I must have lost it or lent it to someone. So sometimes it's that. Sometimes you just know, like, this Miles Davis album is one of the greatest albums ever recorded. I just got to have one. It's that.
Yeah, I've certainly got a few of those. It's, I put them on fairly regularly, but the only reason I necessarily bought them in the first place was, oh, I have to have that because that's, whether it's kind of blue or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like I said, if people have follow-up questions, want to continue the conversation with Michael, I'm sure you can hit him up on Facebook. He's very active there. That's where I was, your birthday recently. It's when the new shelf came out.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And the website was hit me with
MikeFrost.net.
.net. Yeah. So if people want to continue the conversation with Mike after some of the stuff we've talked about, particularly some of the stuff about mission that I'm really interested in, and do encourage you to do so, or you can also get in touch with us here at filthyhopepod@gmail.com. Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you
No
coming.
worries. Yeah, good to talk to you, man.
There we have it. That was our interview with Mike Frost. Like I said in the interview, if you have any questions for him, you can hit him up in all those places. The links will be down below. Or you can follow up with us at filthyhopepod at gmail.com or on socials. As always, if you want to interact with us more directly, you can join our Facebook group that is also down below. And once again, come and join us on June 30th, 6 p.m. at Taramara Uniting Church for our next live event with lots of special guests. Once a couple more guests might be along the way. Once we sort some details out, we will let you know. But the 3 guests that are locked in, I can guarantee that will be there at this moment. Reverend Phil Swain, friend of the show, Somerset Drayton, friend of the show, and Joyce Tungy, soon to be friend of the show from the Pulse team here in New South Wales ACT. So come and join us. We can't wait to see you there. That just about does us. We'll see you next week for another episode of Filthy Hope. Catch you then.
This is a prayer for the people who want to give up, who have been hurt beyond repair and cannot bear to see your face in anything. Find peace in letting go of the guilt that is in yours, and find hope in understanding. Life is not a game you have to win. Forgiveness overwhelming, salvation not deserving. You are loved by something beyond, someone beyond understanding. Drink deep and taste the fullness of life in community.